Welcome back, chess fans. Today I'm going to be starting a new series on anti-Sicilians, and this is going to be the first episode, and I will be focusing on the Closed Sicilian. So let's go. Okay, so welcome back, chess fans. Today we're going to be talking about the Closed Sicilian, and by the way, my overlay right now, this is a Lichess overlay because I do most of my studies on Lichess, although I do play on chess.com mainly. I play on both websites, but I like to do my studies on Lichess. It's just a bit more convenient, so just keep that in mind. That's why the overlay looks like this. So there are a couple of things I want to talk about. First of all, what is a closed Sicilian? So after e4, c5, we know that there are so many ways white can play the position. Many of them involve knight to f3, and here black can also set up the position in different ways. For example, black can go with d6 and then go into various Najdorf positions such as this one. Black can go into the knight c6 Sicilians and then go into open systems here. But closed Sicilian is characterized by white not playing this move d4. So every system that does not involve this pawn to d4 pawn thrust opening up the center is technically a closed Sicilian or some variation of it. So just keep that in mind, okay? And that's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, after, let's say, pawn to d6, pawn to g3, knight f6, and d3, this is generally the main setup that you're going to get against the closed Sicilian when you're playing with the black pieces. This knight can be placed on different squares, and I will get to those setups in a bit more detail a bit later on in this video. But what I want you guys to think about is that these positions always end up being closed. So memorizing all sorts of lines here and all sorts of move orders such as like g6, bishop g7, e5, you do not want to be memorizing all of these moves, okay? You want to be understanding the ideas and you want to be understanding the plans for both sides. This is how you handle these closed positions. If you just memorize one line and then try to play that one line, like for example, you say to yourself, okay, I'm gonna play knight c6, I'm gonna play e6, and then bishop e7 and like bishop d7, something like this, right? Just a very weird setup. It's not necessarily the greatest setup against this system. You're not necessarily going to get great positions. So what I'm trying to teach you today is to think in terms of plans and not actually memorizing every single move, because there's just way too many setups that your opponents can employ, and you cannot memorize every move order against every single one of them. Because for example, white can put the knight on f3, white can put the knight on e2, white can go for knight c3, knight d5 positions if the e6 pawn has not been pushed. White can play knight d2 and then c3, d4. White can play early f4, and these are all different setups that white can play, and you can't possibly have lines prepared for each and every one of them. But if you do know the ideas, then you're basically golden. You're going to be getting decent positions every game. So that's number one. Secondly, going back, I want to talk about the move orders. So here, knight f3 is not the traditional move order of the closed Sicilian. It's actually knight to c3. And let's say here after knight to c6, then white plays g3. And here, white has a little bit more flexibility because he never committed the knight to f3. And instead, he can play a move like f4, put the knight on e2, or play f4 and then put the knight behind the f pawn. That's also a typical setup that white can choose. Now, the reason why this is important is because you also have to know these setups, and not just know these setups, you have to always be aware of the fact that at any point in the first 5 moves, let's just say, white can go for d4 and go into open systems. So this is the reason why I'm going to tell you, if you like to play knight c6 Sicilians, play knight c6. If you like to play the Najdorf Sicilian, for example, here play d6, and after a move like knight to f3, knight f6, if white chooses g3, great, now we're playing the closed Sicilian. If white instead actually changes his mind and chooses d4, now we're transposing back into the main line Najdorf, and if you're not a Najdorf player, you don't know what to do. So that's why I'm telling you guys, play whatever you play in the open, or sorry, in the open system. So if you play the knight c6 lines, play knight c6. If you play some e6 lines, you can start with e6 and so on. You even have to be aware of this move, knight to e2, because if you, for example, here you play g6, boom, d4. Now you're in a dragon type of position, some sort of a accelerated drag, or maybe mainline dragon, I'm not sure, but you are in some form of a dragon, and if you don't play the dragon, then you don't know what to do. So that's why it's important to stay sort of in your comfort zone a lot of the times and play moves that will allow you to not be transposed into an open line that you're not comfortable in. So that's what I wanted to say about move orders. Now, going back, I'm going to, first of all, show you a couple of plans, explain some key ideas, and then we're going to look at a game at the end. Okay, so let's get started here. After knight to f3 in this case, d6, g3, knight to f6, and then d3. So this is the beginning of the closed Sicilian, as we talked about. We play pawn to g6, bishop to g2, bishop to g7, and castles by white, castles by black, and then knight to d2. So here in this case, we are fianchettoing our bishop, and in the closed Sicilian, you always want to fianchetto your bishop, okay? You want to make sure, first of all, that white's not playing d4. After you've made sure of that, then you can go g6 and then bishop to g7. So here, this bishop is always going to be very good because it pressures the whole diagonal, and you're going to see most of the plans in the closed Sicilian are actually based on this bishop having pressure on the diagonal, and then the queenside pawns supporting it, such as b5, b4, for example, to take control of the c3 square. Sometimes there is a pawn on c3, so we're actually directly challenging that pawn. So key ideas for white are generally going to be to expand in the center with c3 to d4, so central expansion, and also not in this setup specifically, but in some setups before the knight is developed to f3, white can actually play f4 and then go h3, g4, f5, so kingside expansion for white and kingside attack. For black, what we want to do is we want to expand on the queen side. This is going to be our plan. This will support our bishop, and this will help our bishop put pressure on this diagonal. Now, let's start with this setup right here, where white has played the knight to f3, knight on d2, and he has pawns set up like this. The main idea here is going to be c3, d4. Here, white's not going to be playing for f4 because he committed the knight to f3 early on, so he never played f4. So his main goal is going to be central expansion. So here, c3 is played by white. We don't allow that. We go e5. Even though this does block our bishop, the bishop will open up in the future via the d5 pawn push and then some sort of e4. That's a bit high level, but even if the bishop here stays on g7, it is okay. You don't have to worry too much. You can go for a d5 pawn break, or you can go for like the f5 pawn break later on. That depends on the situation. But we play e5. We do not allow white to take the whole center. So here white plays a4, just not allowing us to execute our plan with pawn to b5. And here we play a simple move h6, controls all the knight jumps and the bishop going to g5. Now we can safely develop this bishop to the e6 square if we want to, without having to worry about the knight. Knight to c4 here. And I'm not going to explain every single move, but I'm gonna explain the idea. So here, after bishop to e6, let's just say, so we're just developing, nothing crazy going on so far, we play rook to b8. I want you guys to remember this rook b8 move, okay? Whenever you're playing Closed Sicilian from the black side, this move is key, okay? Remember this move. This move is going to be relevant in literally every single setup. And the idea is that you're supporting b5, and if a4 has been pushed, you can go rook b8 and then a6 and b5 just like that. So you do not have to disregard your plan of playing b5 just because a4 has been pushed. You can set it up with rook b8. So rook to b8 here, knight to d2, a little bit of maneuvering by both sides, rook to e1. Here we go b5, en passant, a takes b6, and then knight to e3, knight to e7, and the position can go in this direction, for example. Now, once again, I'm not going to go even more in depth here because this is already 18 moves, but your main idea is queenside expansion, hammering at the queenside. You don't want to play b4 right away, maybe because the bishop has been placed on d2, but you have a lot of space on the queen side and you can start playing on the queen side. For example, this rook that went to b8, it has served this purpose on b8. It can actually go back to a8, and this does occur in a couple of lines where this rook goes to b8, and then once the a file opens up, it goes back to a8 to challenge the a file. This is actually fairly, I wouldn't say necessarily very common, but it can happen in some positions. So this is how you would play against this c3 and then d4 idea, well, d4 as a plan. Okay, so now I want to show you a different kind of setup for black. So let me just, I don't know, okay, Lichess is lagging here a little bit. Let me quickly check what's going on here. Let me refresh the page. There we go. I think it should be fixed. Yeah, okay, it has been fixed. Okay, so let me show you a different setup now, and I'm going to show you a setup where this knight does not go to f6, and instead it goes to e7. Knight to c6, pawn to g3, pawn to g6, bishop to g2, bishop to g7, knight e2, d6, d3, and both sides sort of just developing here. This knight goes to e7. Now, the downside of this move is that you cannot play it very consistently because, as I mentioned earlier in the video, you have to watch out for for various d4 pawn pushes that will force you to go into lines where you're not very comfortable. So that's why this knight usually cannot go to e7, but if white plays an early g3 instead of playing with this knight, then you can opt for this setup where the knight does not actually go to f6, it goes to e7. And this has a couple of upsides. Well, it has one major upside, and that is the fact that you're not blocking the f pawn, which means you can actually fight back on the f file in a single move. So what that might look like is, let me just make a couple of moves on the board. Here, bishop to e3 played by white. We do not want to allow d4 by white, so we block that square with our knight. And then after f4, castles, let's say queen to d2, rook to b8. Once again, key move, remember this. We want to expand on the queen side with b5, b4. Here knight to d1 is played. Let's say we go b5, c3, we capture, and in a couple of moves we just expand on the queen side. We continue with our plan, and after a white plays a move like g4, here is when we see the benefit of having this knight placed on e7 rather than f6. Here we can strike back against this with f5, and this is actually quite good because if we don't allow f5 by white, that means that the bishop stays closed because the pawn on f4 is blocking the bishop. The rook also stays closed here, and generally the rule of thumb here is that if white takes with the e pawn, you want to take with the g pawn, and if white takes with the g pawn, you want to take with the e pawn. Although if g pawn takes on f5, you can actually take either way, but the general rule of thumb is that you want to take with the opposite pawn. So if takes like this, you take with the g pawn. If takes with the g pawn, you take with the e pawn, and the position is fairly fine. from here you have a decent position. I would say perhaps better, slightly better for black. It's -1 here. So there you go. That's one way you can handle this position, with having this knight placed on e7 rather than f6. So let me move on to the next setup here, and while I'm doing that, let me quickly take a sip of my water because my throat is getting a bit dry. Give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. Make sure you guys stay hydrated. Always stay hydrated during your games. Okay, so after e4, c5, let me just skip forward here a little bit. So we have the same exact setup, but instead now this knight has been developed to c3. It has not been developed to d2, because earlier we saw in this chapter that the knight that's on c3 right now was developed to d2 and then c3, and the idea was d4, but we stopped it with e5. So knight on c3 changes the position in a very specific way. There is one key idea that white can employ here, one key positional idea. Let's say knight to c6, and then here we see that positional idea specifically, knight to d5, jumping into the center. Now at first glance this might look bad, because okay, we take the knight, and then there are some doubled pawns on the d file. Isn't this good for us? Well, it's okay. It's not exactly winning. Like if I turn the computer on, this position is not going to be winning for the black pieces, but it's still a game and it's still an idea. Rook to e1 can be played, and the main pressure here is going to be built up on the e file, and the main play is generally going to be on the e file. Sometimes you're going to strike back with a move like e6 to get rid of this pawn, because it's actually quite annoying. So that's not what we want to do, at least right away. We don't have to take. We can continue with our plan of rook to b8 to expand on the queen side. Once again, rook b8, key move. Do not forget this. So a4 played by white, and here we can take because we can park our knight on b4. The a pawn has been moved, so the b4 square has been sort of weakened at least a little bit. For example, if c4 is played here, this is positionally awful for the white pieces, because the b4 square is completely gone. So that's why we waited for a4, is because now white does not have the option of playing c4. Earlier he could have played c4 and then played a3 to kick our knight, but here he does not have that option. So instead he has to defend the pawn with the bishop, and then we strike back here with e6, takes, and a play might continue with something like c3. We go back, knight to f3, and here is when my analysis ends. Now you guys can play like knight to e5, for example, and if white takes, you take back, you have some pressure on d3. Of course, white doesn't have to take. There are various different lines here, but the position is in the balance here. Maybe black is slightly better, like a minuscule advantage for black. Not much, but that's what happens in chess. If both sides play perfectly, it's going to be a draw. You're not exactly winning the game. But the plans still apply here. Actually, it's not exactly quite the same, because the position is a little bit more open now. You do not have to go for this a6 b5. The main point here is going to be fighting on the e file. You might also want to play h6 here to stop anything from going to g5. So that's going to be your main ideas. Okay, so let me now move on to a different setup, and let me show you this one, for example. So again, the beginning moves are fairly similar. We want to fianchetto our bishop. Here, white played g3, so we want to play g6 because he committed the pawn already, or the bishop already also. Bishop to g7, and then knight to e2. And now this setup is a little bit different, because here the c pawn is blocked. There's no c3 d4, but the f pawn has not been blocked. So here white's plan is going to be pushing f4. and after a couple of moves you're gonna see, well, first of all, white plays h3, stopping anything from accessing this square, and also there are some lines where if f4 is played right away, black can go bishop to g4 and then exchange this bishop for the knight. The reason why this is actually somewhat decent is because there is a kingside fianchetto here. Whenever there is a kingside fianchetto, generally this bishop, queenside bishop, doesn't really have a good square, because if it goes to g4, let's say h3, you cannot necessarily like go back here, because then your bishop gets trapped. So this actually happens in a lot of openings where there's a kingside fianchetto. You can go bishop g4 and trade the bishop for the knight, although in my opinion these lines are not really that great. Like, I don't think these lines are that accurate, but that's just my personal preference. But in this case, white just simply prevents all of that by playing h3, and then here rook to b8. Once again, key move, do not forget this. You want to expand on the queen side. f4 played by white, and then after bishop to d7 here, you continue with a6 because a4 was played. You break out with b5, takes, and then you jump in the center with knight to d4, and then you get this sort of position, like bishop to b5, and then this is how this position can go. Now, I want to talk about this knight specifically. Whenever it's not developed to e7 and instead it is developed to f6, it has two maneuvering ideas. One of them is knight to d7, knight to e5. So remaneuvering this knight to the e5 square. And actually in this case, I believe that's what happens, because the bishop is also on b5, and they're both pressuring the d3 pawn. And what we can do here is we can actually go for b3. If the pawn is taken, this is positionally just dead for the white pieces, because this pawn is simply falling. I'm not sure which capture is better. Both of them are good according to the computer. They're actually equally good. Maybe knight is slightly to be preferred. But here c4 can be played, bishop back to d7, and you can continue playing in this style. So this maneuvering sequence of the knight going to d7 and then to e5, this is very important when these f4 h3 g4 systems are played, because once f5 is played, the e5 square is weakened, and this is a fantastic square for this f6 knight. Now there's another maneuvering idea, but that's a bit more rare. Like for example, instead of a4, let's say like g4 is played right away. I think this is the line. Yeah, like let's say b5 here, and then knight to g3, b4, knight here. We get a very similar sequence, but there's another maneuvering idea, and that's knight to e8, knight to c7, and then knight to b5. And this idea, and what this does is it remaneuvers the knight to b5, where it controls the squares, mainly d4. This is the most important one, but actually c3 is also equally important. I take that back, not mainly d4. It controls both d4 and the c3 square. So let me show you a line where something like that can happen. Let me just turn the engine on just so I don't say something like really stupid. Yeah, so this knight goes to b5, and when this knight is on b5, c3 can be played or cannot be played, because it also the knight also controls c3. So the pawn, the knight, and the bishop can control c3, and we're basically shutting down white's pawn play in the center, so we're not allowing these pawns to advance, and this is quite useful. White cannot simply just take more space. This is a bit more rare, and this is a very advanced idea. It works in positions where a4 hasn't been played, like for example here after a4 a6. According to the to my analysis, here it's not quite as good, I suspect, because here knight d4 has already been played, but you know, it's still an idea that you can keep in mind. It's a bit more rare, but still something I wanted to show you guys. So that's what you can do with this knight also. So now that we are done talking about all of these setups, I want to show you guys a game played between Nigel Short and Garry Kasparov. I believe this game was played in 2001. Yes, yeah, it was played in 2001. And here it was the Sicilian defense. I will also just show you the accuracy of this game. It was 93 and 94. And here Nigel Short played the Closed Sicilian. He initiated the Closed Sicilian. And what Garry Kasparov did is basically what we've been talking about, but here he played early f4, and now he's gonna place the knight in front or behind the f-pawn. So knight to f6, knight to f3, castles, rook to b8 here, h3, b5. So we're seeing this queenside expansion. Here a3 chosen by Nigel Short, stopping b4. But of course here we don't play a6 anymore. We actually go a5, and that's what Kasparov did. Now he wants to play b4 anyways. He's not allowing Nigel Short to just simply disallow him to play b4. So bishop to e3, and here we see this idea knight to d7. And what this does is, as I said earlier, you can always jump to e5. It also stops various tactical opportunities. Sometimes e5 hits the knight on c6 with a tempo, and also it hits the knight on f6. In this case, there's a knight on f3, so that wouldn't even work. But it's still very important, and that's also why rook b8 is quite useful. Not only it supports a b5 pawn push, it also gets off this diagonal. So knight to d7 chosen by Kasparov, and here rook to b1 has been played, or was played, and after b4 takes, knight to e2, knight back to e2, bishop to b7, pawn to g4, both sides simply improving their positions. And here, remember I said earlier that sometimes this rook goes to b8, but then it fights back on a8 again. Here we are seeing that idea in full motion. Rook back to a8, pawn to c4, chosen by Nigel Short. Analysis calls this an inaccuracy, but it's very debatable whether this is a mistake or inaccuracy or not. It's probably an okay move. It controls these two squares, and maybe it was not necessary right here, because as I said, if the knight was on c7 ready to jump to b5, then it would make a lot more sense to play c4, because then you would be controlling some knight jumps. Here maybe it just wasn't as necessary, but it's still probably okay. A pawn to e6 chosen by Kasparov. He wants to set up and execute d5, and after g5 he prepares that, and then he plays pawn to d5, breaking in the center. Of course, this position is getting super complicated, and I don't want to actually show the whole game, because we want to focus on the opening here. I will just briefly go through the last part fairly quickly. There's an attack on the bishop, so that's why it's not so easy to capture this pawn. And the game went on something like this, where both sides sort of just maneuvered around, and Garry was trying to find a breakthrough on the queen side. Nigel Short was defending quite well, and here it was sort of a back and forth game. White was better in some moments, black was slightly better in some other moments, but at the end of the day, game ended in a draw, I believe. After a couple of moves, both of these gentlemen made a draw. So I'm not gonna go into too much depth on the whole game, because we mainly want to focus on the opening here and the early middle game, and this is exactly where the game ended. But you can see a lot of the ideas that I explained today executed by Kasparov. If I go back here, this idea knight d7, this rook b8. If you take away one thing from this video, take away rook b8, and then start playing b5, b4. If they play a3, b5, a5, b4. So that's what I want you guys to remember. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope my guide on the Closed Sicilian was comprehensive, and I will see you in the next one, and I will actually start covering a lot of anti-Sicilians. Perhaps next time I will do the Grand Prix attack, or maybe Smith Mora. I don't know. So I will see you guys next time. Peace.